Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Claire Galafaro. I'm a national writer at the Associated Press. I have been covering the drug crisis in the United States for many years. And when fentanyl started flooding into the country nearly a decade ago now, the death toll from drugs skyrocketed year after year, record-breaking numbers of dead Americans, 50,000, 70,000. I remember thinking, at one point that it couldn't possibly keep getting worse. But then it did. We were all fixated rightly on the horrific toll of COVID-19, and for good reason. But at the same time, more than 100,000 Americans died in a single year from overdose. That's more than the population of Albany, New York, or Roanoke, Virginia. And maybe scariest of all, the demographics are shifting. We have often thought of the opioid epidemic as a white people problem, but fentanyl has so seeped into the entire drug supply. People are dying now from cocktails of fentanyl and meth, fentanyl and fake pills, fentanyl and crack cocaine. And what that's meant on the streets is that people in our poorest, most vulnerable communities in this country are dying at breathtaking rates. In some cities, Black men are dying at 4 or 5 times the rate of white people. During the pandemic, the rate at which Native Americans are dying surpassed white people to become the highest in the nation. These are communities that we have failed over and over again, and we are failing them again. One morning during the darkest days of the pandemic on a Native American reservation in northern Minnesota, a mother opened her son's bedroom door and found him dead. She screamed so loud, she woke up all of her neighbors. He was 24. An autopsy later found that it was a combination of fentanyl and Xanax. At first, she kept his ashes in a normal urn and she slept with it. So a friend made her this leather bag so she could cuddle with it more comfortably. She carries this bag around with her. She takes it out to dinner. She talks to the bag. She plays it her son's favorite songs. She kisses it goodnight. The thing that's hard for me sometimes to wrap my head around is that we make more than 250 families like this every single day. That's how many people die on average to drug overdoses in the United States alone. And that's how many families are left behind to grapple with the consequences of that. It's a nightmare. And it's hard to find hope in all of that despair. And so that is why I'm so honored to be here today with these incredible minds to try to search for solutions to finally getting this crisis under control. So just some brief introductions of who you'll be hearing from today. Vonda Feldman-Brown is the author of the impressive research you'll learn about. It is available on the Brookings website, that's brookings.edu. She is a senior fellow in the Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, where she has been involved in the Institute's ongoing coverage of the opioid epidemic. She is an expert on international conflict and crime. Her fieldwork has taken her around the globe, including Afghanistan, Burma, Mexico, Somalia, Ethiopia, and she's joining us today, I believe, from the UK. She is the author of many books and articles and frequently provides congressional testimony. Rupert Stone is a freelance journalist, born in London and based in Istanbul. He covers drugs and security issues in South Asia and the Middle East. He has written for Newsweek, Al Jazeera English, Vice, and others. Ryan Haas is a senior fellow and the Michael H. Armacost Chair in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. His research focuses on the pressing political, economic, and security challenges in East Asia. Among many other accomplishments, Ryan was a Foreign Service Officer at the US Embassy in Beijing before joining the National Security Council in 2013. In that role, he advised the White House on US policy towards China, Taiwan, and Mongolia. So we are obviously in really impressive company today. So just a brief overview before we get started. We will hear a bit from Vonda about her research. Then we'll have a discussion with our panelists. We're reserving the last half hour for questions. So feel free to submit any questions as we go along, and we will get to as many as we can at the end. Thank you again for being here today. And Vonda, congrats on this work. I find it incredibly chilling, especially showing how the drug traffickers seem to be way ahead of our efforts to control the flood of drugs. If China does better, it might just shift to India or elsewhere. Is there any hope? And what is the best way forward?
Thank you very much, Claire. It's great to be with Rupert and with Ryan and with you speaking again about this issue, even though, as you said, the issue is devastating and a lot of the discussion will be not easy and does not easily provide clear and happy solutions. Now, when you and I last engaged in another Brookings public forum, we were at the time speaking about another project on opioids, the Brookings opioid crisis in America, domestic and international dimensions, that explored various elements of how to deal with the opioid crisis, including how to expand access to treatment, how to expand access to harm reduction measures such as to reverse overdose, naloxone medication, as well as very innovative and often controversial elements such as methadone maintenance, supervised prescription sites. And those are still very crucial elements. Indeed, I would posit that unless we vastly expand treatment and do better on prevention, although prevention is difficult in this domain like in others, we will not be able to see significant reductions in the horrific death toll. Nonetheless, this project today that we are speaking and the report that you mentioned looks at supply side measures. It is part of a larger Brookings project on China's role in various illegal economies, including drug trafficking. And the reason we are talking about China in this context is because China remains the principal supplier of precursor chemicals for the production of fentanyl, not just in the United States, but across all of North America, which now includes both Canada, that is dealing with as devastating synthetic opioid crisis as the United States. And we are seeing also the spread of fentanyl in various parts of Mexico. So until about 2018, 2019, China was the direct principal supplier of fentanyl, of the finished synthetic opioid, fentanyl, very potent, highly deadly, very lethal. That was shipped directly from China to the United States. But as a result of years of diplomacy spanning really 2 or 3 US administrations, including the one that my colleague Ryan Haas worked during the Obama administration, the United States persuaded China to schedule the entire class of fentanyl drugs. So fentanyl is just one example of a certain type of synthetic opioids. And one of the reasons why control is difficult is because chemists find it very easy to simply alter a certain molecular structure while preserving the core effects of the synthetic opioids, and thus avoid law enforcement action and controls. So in 2019, China put in place, as a result of US pressure and engagement, the scheduling of the entire class of fentanyl-type drugs. And there was a great deal of hope that this would result in palpable reduction in the overdose and lethality in the United States. And that did not happen at all. In fact, as you mentioned, we saw the most devastating year yet with over 100,000 deaths. And we also are increasingly seeing fentanyl being mixed to all manner of drugs. Now, why is that? What has happened? The scheduling in China did result in suppliers in China changing shifting to so-called precursor chemicals. Precursors are and pre-precursors are the chemicals from which drugs like fentanyl are produced. And instead of shipping fully finished fentanyl into the United States, they now ship those precursors and pre-precursors to Mexico, from which Mexican criminal groups, principally the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, produce fentanyl that they then mix into other chemicals like prescription drugs or methamphetamines or heroin, and ship into the United States. So the scheduling in China has had some effects, but it hasn't had the effects that the United States was hoping for. But unfortunately, since that scheduling, we have seen significant decrease in the level of US-China cooperation. And here is something I look forward to hearing Ryan's comments, reflections. Essentially, China was most willing to engage in intense, by its standards, counter-narcotics cooperations with the United States when it believed that extending that cooperation would produce a warming in the overall bilateral geostrategic relationship between the United States and China. And that did not happen. During the Trump administration, the relationship progressively deteriorated, and intense challenges and difficulties remain still in the Biden administration. And so as long as China really does not assess that the bilateral relationship would improve, it's withholding cooperation on counter-narcotics. Now, we have to be honest that supply-side measures alone are not going to resolve the immense challenge and the overdose death in the United States. Even if China were more willing to cooperate, still massive challenges would remain, including because of the difficulties of controlling supply out of any country, including out of China, and because of the possibility of a source of precursors relocating to many other countries. But the picture is all the more challenging because the cooperation is not there. And that gives a drug trafficking group a great sense of impunity. It complicates other dimensions of the relationship. And it also highlights how China views law enforcement cooperation with the United States, with the West, but even with Southeast Asian countries, and how and when it acts against criminal groups. It tends to act robustly against criminal groups when they cross the interests of Chinese government authorities and the Chinese Communist Party. But at the same time, many Chinese triads, Chinese criminal groups cultivate the political capital with Chinese authorities by acting as enforcers against the diaspora community, by promoting legal businesses alongside of illegal businesses. And thus, very rarely, China, in fact, tends to act against the top echelons of the triads that are critical suppliers of precursor chemicals for fentanyl, but also for methamphetamine across Southeast Asia. But the picture is even more complicated, and I will leave it at that, because the triads are not the sole supplier of these precursor chemicals. In fact, they dominate the meth supply in Southeast Asia, but in the fentanyl space, there are very many other suppliers, middle-sized chemical firms, small-sized chemical brokers that sometimes knowingly cater to Mexican cartels, sometimes unknowingly sell precursor chemicals, many of which are dual use to a very wide variety of buyers, including criminal groups. So law enforcement and supply side control measures are enormously difficult in this space, are enormously difficult in the space of synthetic drugs overall. But at the same time, cooperation is struggling and is very limited because of the geopolitical difficulties in the bilateral relationship.
Thanks, Zonda. And maybe Ryan, maybe you would be the best person to chime in first on this question, but can you talk about how the COVID pandemic changed the US-China relationship and what impact that has had on drug trafficking and drug trafficking enforcement?
Well, Claire, first, it's wonderful to be with you and with this group, Vonda. Thanks for bringing me into the conversation. My general sense is that there was an expectation amongst those that were involved in the U.S.-China relationship that if there was this meteor-like moment where there's a meteor coming to Earth that's crashing and threatening the survival of humanity, that the United States and China would be able to drop their swords and find ways to cooperate for the protection of their own people and the people of the world. COVID was sort of an analog to a meteor moment. It threatened everyone across the world. And instead of dropping their swords and coming together, what we found was that COVID sharpened the divisions that existed between the United States and China. It caused both countries to engage in a certain degree of blamesmanship, to compete for relative advantage against each other, and really to fail the test of leadership when the world was looking to the world's two most capable powers to protect their people. And I think in China, the pandemic experience to a certain extent hardened a view that the United States was decadent and undisciplined, that it was incapable of controlling problems within its borders as COVID ravaged across the country. And it sort of signaled a sign of a broader breakdown in social cohesion within the United States. There were daily reports inside China of the mass scale of deaths that were occurring as COVID was pretty well controlled within China at that time. And it just sort of, it fed this narrative of American decline and Americans' diminished capacity to take hard measures to prevent catastrophes. And this has a direct connection to what we're talking about today, because I think it hardened a view that the opioid problem is a supply side problem, that it's a problem of the United States government being incapable of limiting the flow of fentanyl and other opioids inside the United States, and Americans being unable to suppress their insatiable desire for these drugs. And so that's the prism and the frame through which a lot of these discussions are being filtered as the discussion is taking place in China today.
That's really interesting. Rupert, I think that maybe you've done some reporting on this issue. Do you have insight into what's been happening since the COVID pandemic began?
Yes. Well, firstly, thanks for including me in this panel. I'm delighted to be here. I mean, generally, we've seen during COVID and longer term than that, the synthetic drugs trade has been booming. And we've seen this in North America with fentanyl, as Vanda's report shows, from seizures and drug overdose deaths, and also in the Golden Triangle, which is where Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand intersect, and is one of the real epicenters of global methamphetamine production, and is probably the top world producer of methamphetamine. And in both these regions, we've seen an incredible boom during COVID. So there are aspects, I mean, as I said, this is a longer term phenomenon, but there are aspects of the COVID pandemic and changes during it that have facilitated this. One of them is the fact that life has moved online to a degree, and quite a bit of the synthetic drugs trade, especially when it comes to fentanyl, is conducted online by online sellers. There's also been a greater shift towards contactless delivery and payment, so use of mail, for example. And fentanyl is so small, I mean, and so potent, that you don't need many tablets. You don't need to supply many tablets to the US market, so it can fit into letters and packages quite easily. So again, this aspect of the fentanyl trade has overlapped with COVID in a way that gives it a further boost. Another aspect of things is that the supply disruptions that we've seen during COVID to trade, which especially during the initial phases, is again something that the synthetic drug trade is well equipped to handle, because the chemists can innovate with new chemicals, devise new formulae. So if supplies of certain chemicals are disrupted, they can sort of concoct new chemical formulae and new drugs. And that's something we could get into perhaps in greater detail later, but there's interesting material in Vanda's report on innovation with precursors. And that's something you can't do with a drug like heroin or cocaine, which are based on, largely on plants. But with drugs that are made in laboratories like meth or fentanyl, you can play around with the chemistry, you can use new chemicals and devise new formulae. So that's another thing. And then the final thing I'd say is, this is something, Claire, in your reporting you've illuminated, is the social devastation that the pandemics created. Not only the economic stresses, the unemployment, poverty, etc., but the anxiety and so on has obviously driven more people into synthetic drugs, and the fact that they're so relatively cheap. Fentanyl is cheaper than heroin, so that again is something that fits well, if you can call it well, into the pandemic environment, because people are more stretched economically, so the drugs are more affordable for them. and of course, treatment centers have been disrupted, which is another factor that has made the opioid epidemic worse. So those are the issues I'd say we're seeing with COVID.
Rhonda, did you want to chime in on that question as well? I think that you've done some research into how the trafficking patterns themselves have changed because of border restrictions and things like that because of the COVID pandemic, and how drug trafficking organizations have innovated around those measures.
Sure. Let me make 2 points. One that sort of is beyond and above the pandemic. Namely that from a trafficker's perspective, synthetic drugs, particularly synthetic opioids, are enormously advantageous. As Rupert just mentions, they are enormously potent. And one implication then is that one needs to smuggle much less of it to supply the market. So to supply the entire US market with heroin, estimates by RAND and the Congressional Commission on Combating Synthetic Opioids Trafficking estimate that one needs roughly 4750 metric tons of heroin. But to supply the entire US market with fentanyl for a year, it takes only about 5 tons of fentanyl. So 1/10 of that amount. And the same difference also applies to precursor chemicals. To produce to produce heroin, one also needs precursor chemicals, but to produce synthetic opioid, one needs a tiny fraction of the precursor chemicals that are needed. So if one is a trafficker, one has to smuggle much less. Buying precursor chemicals in China or from India, another place of supply, is very inexpensive because one needs to smuggle much less. That means much less expenditure on corrupting officials along the supply line and ports of entry. It also needs much less expenditure in the amount of stuff that needs to be shipped. And one can still produce enormously potent drugs with which one can supply a large market. And one doesn't need to control territory. If you want to grow coca, or if you want to grow poppy in order to produce cocaine and heroin, you need to control territory. At least you need to prevent government from being able to destroy those plants and recruit enough people that will be economically driven or otherwise driven to cultivating those plants. But as to supply drugs, all you need is a few small labs with very few cooks, and they don't have to be very sophisticated cooks. So in many of these markets, synthetic drugs in general, and particularly synthetic opioids, are not something that users at least initially choose. They might not often know that they are in fact buying something that has fentanyl mixed into it. They might think they are still buying cocaine, and in fact will be given by the dealer a mixture of cocaine and fentanyl. Now, specifically to the issue of innovation. So, early on the COVID pandemic, we saw some drug supply lines being disrupted, and cartels adapted in a variety of ways, including laying off people to save money, just like legal businesses would. They were stocking particular chemicals. They were charging much more for particular chemicals, or were being charged more. They also innovated in ways such as resorting much more to use drones. And again, synthetic opioids pose an enormous advantage from the supply perspective here for them. It would take many drones to supply drugs like cocaine and heroin because of the price potency ratio. But with these very powerful synthetic opioids, some of which are far more powerful than fentanyl, like carfentanil, all of a sudden supply, not just retail to the user, but even wholesale supply becomes much more feasible with commercial drones. So that was just one of the innovations that we have seen. But the bottom line is that COVID might have disrupted some global supply chains. It did not disrupt drug supply chains adequately, and not in any ways that in fact benefited users.
Yeah. Well, we often think about the consequences of all of this as an American problem. Addiction is an American problem. And Ryan, I think that you mentioned that in terms of how China presents this issue to its own people and considers this issue. I mean, but what is the threat to the rest of the world as fentanyl trafficking expands? I mean, are we seeing addiction and death take root in other parts of the world outside of the United States? And Rupert, do you maybe want to start there?
Yes, I mean, it's we're into a world of very limited evidence. And I think generally a very important caveat when discussing, especially a kind of clandestine business like the drugs trade is, we always have to be conscious of what we don't know. There are various ways of quantifying the drug market through seizures and triangulating that with price and government reporting and things like this. But you're always in, the serious limitation on our knowledge. So when it comes to the expansion of fentanyl, I mean, the fact that we don't have a great deal of evidence that it's expanded, for instance, in Europe, South Asia, or even Southeast Asia. But that doesn't mean it hasn't penetrated these areas. We just might not know about it. However, that said, I mean, fentanyl is so lethal. If it had made its way into the drug supply, I think we'd be seeing, for example, in a place like India or Myanmar, or Southeast Asia, we'd be seeing a lot more overdose deaths from it, probably than we are. So, and another fact to mention that's mentioned in Vanda's report is in South and Southeast Asia specifically, the anti-drug forces don't typically test for fentanyl when they seize drugs and they conduct forensic analysis. They test for drugs that are most commonly found. So, for instance, heroin or meth, but they wouldn't necessarily test for fentanyl. So they might just be missing it. They might seize it. It might be contained, for instance, in heroin seizures. Heroin might be adulterated with fentanyl, as in the US, and they're just not picking it up. So there could be a lot more of it than we know. But I suspect because of the lack of overdose deaths, it's not yet taken off in these regions.
Claire, maybe I can come in and just add a few dimensions here. I mean, we are slowly starting to see seizures and incidents of overdose in other parts of the world, such as in Argentina, in the Southern Cone. And because the supply and spread of fentanyl, even in North America, was very much driven by criminal groups, driven by the large cartels, not something that users were asking for. I suspect that it's simply a matter of time before we start seeing much more of a spread in Asia, in Western Europe. Would also add here that in the drug policy field, we have these puzzles as to why there are gaps in how drug markets evolve. So back in the 1980s, when cocaine started spreading in the United States and came to dominate US drug consumption, there was plenty of cocaine availability and certainly plenty of potential cocaine availability. And cocaine could have been supplied to Western Europe. And yet Western Europe was using predominantly heroin. There was no good reason why this happened. The linkages between South American, the Colombian cartels at the time, and Italian and other criminal entities in Europe existed. There was plenty of coke, but West European users were simply used to heroin. And so there was this narrative that the West European market is a heroin market, the US market is a cocaine market. Until we hit the 1990s and meth takes off in the United States, and all of a sudden cocaine takes off in Europe. And I'm hearing similar comments about, well, there is plenty of heroin in Western Europe. Western Europe will not have problems with fentanyl. And I hope that will still stay the case because of the lethality and overdose problem. But I also don't believe that it will likely stay the case. That in fact, we are going to start seeing the emergence of these extraordinarily dangerous drugs in other parts of the world, like Western Europe. Now, let me add sort of one other comment here before handing it to Ryan for his reflection on China, specifically to talk about China. So Ryan was very accurate in how he described China's thinking about fentanyl. On the one hand, China really considered itself one of the toughest and most important drug ops globally. And because of its history, the devastating opium addiction, opium misuse in China in the early 20th century, stemming from the opium wars and other dimensions, China, both as a government and many Chinese people, tend to have a very restrictive view toward the use of narcotics drugs. But at the same time, there's been significant expansion, and there continues to be an expansion of the use of narcotic drugs in China. It's mostly heroin, and it's very significantly methamphetamine. China so far hasn't really experienced much of a fentanyl problem, in fact, really at all much of a fentanyl problem. And so the Chinese government assumes that that will remain the case and portrays its law enforcement actions, limited and sporadic as they are, and its scheduling of fentanyl class drugs as a humanitarian gesture toward the United States. And it very much rejects a sense of co-responsibility as being the source country. Many Chinese people do not know that fentanyl or fentanyl precursors originate in China, and China talks of its actions of great benevolence, humanitarian gesture, and sort of lays the responsibility solely on the United States, on US drug habits, as it talks about them, and on the lack of US law enforcement actions. And China adopts the same attitude toward Mexico, which is now the receiver of precursor chemicals from China. It tells the Mexican government, you know, precursors might be coming from China. That's your problem. It's your corrupt custom official. You deal with it. Now, just 2 weeks ago, we saw the UN Commission on Narcotics Drugs to schedule 3 additional precursors for fentanyl and fentanyl type class drugs. That's a good development. China was part of that scheduling. It would not have happened with China's opposition. But I fear that's also the extent of cooperation that we are going to see for some considerable while.
I mean, I think Vanda has really, and Rupert have hit the nail on the head on this. It's a real challenge for us to break through to our Chinese friends and counterparts about the risks that they face of allowing this this epidemic to continue to spread. I think that there is a view, as Vanda described, that that fentanyl and these other issues, they're a Western problem, an American problem, not a Chinese problem. My response is there is no societal immunity to these issues. These are issues that spread, and for the very practical reasons that Vanda described of why it's so economical for drug traffickers to use fentanyl and fentanyl-related products, this is a danger to the Chinese. And if they don't wrap their arms around it sooner, they're going to be harmed later. And you know, there may be an opportunity for the United States to share with their Chinese counterparts, law enforcement, drug enforcement experts, the challenges that we faced, the difficulties and the harms to our society that have been caused by this this epidemic in the United States, not as a warning, but just as simply an observation of the reality that we confront, and that someday, if China is not careful, they will confront as well. And I would just like to add, 2 other factors on top of what Vanda and Rupert have so expertly described, one of which is that China has a very powerful pharmaceutical industry of its own. And I think that there is a certain reticence to be seen as limiting the actions of their own pharmaceutical industry, particularly when they don't feel particularly threatened themselves by the spread of fentanyl. And why would they, in their judgment, why would they do this as a favor to Washington without the ability to receive anything in return from the United States in terms of overall improvement to the relationship? I think there's a view that that even if a view in Beijing that even if China did crack down on its own pharmaceutical industry, it wouldn't solve the problem because the problem is inherently an American supply side problem, not a Chinese source problem. And I think that they also like to hide behind the argument that that China alone cannot take actions, that unless there's a coordinated international response to schedule a lot more of these dual use items, that China will be doing harm to itself without addressing the problems, which are sort of a collective action problem around the world. So these are just additional barriers that I think that we need to run up against and over time barrel through. But it's worth us putting them on the table to start this conversation, just so we know the challenges in front of us.
And Vonda, I mean, in some ways, does China sort of have a point in that regard? I mean, as we are criticizing that country for not controlling better the supply of drugs, I think that we've, in this country, clearly have a broken mental health and addiction treatment infrastructure. I mean, what role does the United States have in ending this problem?
Well, clearly, Claire, a lot, much more needs to happen on the US domestic side. Whether this is expanding access to treatment in very many different dimensions, including better access to health coverage of treatment, whether this is thinking innovatively and radically, as we said at the beginning, such as about heroin maintenance, supervised injection sites. All issues, incidentally, which China also needs to adopt domestically in the drug issues that China is struggling with, which is heroin and meth. We don't have very good data from China, but China's use has likely been continuously expanding in both meth and heroin. And to the extent that China does get exercise about international law enforcement cooperation and counter-narcotics cooperation, it is mostly about issue that it's struggling with. So methamphetamine and heroin coming mostly from Myanmar, and methamphetamine coming to China also from Myanmar these days. And I think that the meth story is actually quite a useful one because of several dimensions. So until the early 2010s, sort of 2012, 2013, 2014, China was not just a consumer of methamphetamine, but also a very large supplier of methamphetamine. And it was the predominant supplier of meth across various parts of Asia Pacific, including Australia. And as a result of intense bilateral law enforcement cooperations with Australia, which was China's most intense law enforcement cooperation with any country, China ultimately decided to crack down on the large booming meth production in southern China that involved not just the triads as suppliers, but also involved entire villages and regions really that were producing meth and shipping it out abroad. China mostly eliminated a lot of the domestic production, even as it really did not move to dismantle the Chinese triad, and particularly the upper echelons, for reasons that are highlighted. That in fact there is a complex relationship between the Chinese government and organized crime groups abroad, as long as Chinese criminal groups are not violent at home, as they by and large are, and they serve other interests of the Chinese government, controlling, monitoring the diaspora, acting against diaspora members that go against the interest of the Chinese Communist Party or the government. They tend to often have significant amount of leeway, and China does not choose often to act against them. But when this the suppression of production in China took place, production relocated to Myanmar. However, the supplier of precursor chemicals remained China. And for a long time, China maintained in Southeast Asia essentially the same attitude as it did with the United States and fentanyl and precursors for fentanyl. These chemicals are illegal. We cannot act against them. They are your problem, Myanmar. You need to crack down on them. But as meth use in China has continued to expand, China became more diligent and determined to be cracking down even against the supply of precursor chemicals that are legal. For example, there is so-called ghost list, which is chemicals that are dual use, that are not scheduled, but nonetheless are clearly used for the production of methamphetamine. And China at various times has imposed more stringent monitoring, conducted raids and actions against the large Chinese pharmaceutical industry because those chemicals are ultimately producing meth that's being consumed in China. Similarly, China has come under very intense criticism from Southeast Asia, where meth use disorders have expanded dramatically. In places like Laos or Vietnam, we are seeing 6 times the rate of consumption that we saw just a few years ago, sometimes 2-3 years ago, very recently. And this is a region where China is very focused on its power projections, on its geopolitical interest. And as a result of wanting to prioritize those interests, it has become, at least to some extent, more responsive to countries in the region and has stepped up often law enforcement cooperation. Now, China is enormously active in regional drug diplomacy. And Ryan, can really come in with lots of significant information here. China likes international fora and it likes the international diplomacy and likes to dominate those meetings. But between the diplomatic engagement and actual law enforcement on the ground cooperation, there is a significant gap. And that law enforcement on the ground cooperation tends to be very self-serving, very limited, and very narrow, really often prioritizing very narrow set of interests of the Chinese government, as opposed to more broadly cast law enforcement cooperation against any kind of rule of law violation.
Ryan, did you want to add your perspective on that?
Well, I think Vonda is exactly right. The Chinese increasingly are relying upon and leaning upon law enforcement cooperation as a strong tool for their overall diplomacy. Part of what I think the Chinese are trying to do is to make their form of social control more acceptable, more tolerated, more legitimized through its broad application in many countries around the world. So it's not a coincidence, for example, that we see when there is social instability in the Marshall Islands or Kyrgyzstan, it's China that offers immediately to dispatch law enforcement support to help stabilize the situation and restore order and civility in those places. So they see this as a key tool for them to expand their influence abroad. I think particularly within their own region, they want their tools of law enforcement to be seen as legitimate. And so I think it's wise to think about the countries around China that are being most impacted by China's production of these precursor chemicals, and to see if there is space to work with them to help raise expectations from within the region to China, for China, if they want to be seen as the model of law enforcement cooperation and leadership, that this is an area where they need to take action themselves.
We are all watching this horrific war unfold in Ukraine. Obviously, China seems to be friendly with Russia. So I'm curious about what this conflict might mean for the US-China relationship and what that might mean in terms of drug trafficking going forward. And Ryan, I mean, it seems like you might be, sorry to pick on you here for a bit, but it seems like you might be the best person to start us off on that.
Well, I will get us started and quickly pass off the baton to Rupert and Vonda. I think that, crises compel prioritization, right? So in the near term, I think there is going to be a real priority in the US-China relationship on addressing American concerns about China's support for Russia as Russia is prosecuting an invasion of its neighbor and killing thousands of innocent civilians. So in the near term, I think there's going to be a real emphasis in US-China bilateral diplomacy on urging China not to backfill international sanctions against Russia and provide economic cushioning to them, in urging China not to provide weapons that could be used in the war in Ukraine. and in trying to push China to stop spreading disinformation that Russia is propagating. And that's going to occupy a lot of space in the bilateral relationship for the foreseeable future. It will probably crowd out other conversations that need to happen, including on law enforcement and counter-narcotics cooperation. But if the United States and China are capable of finding a way to work in parallel to hasten the end of this conflict, to accelerate the process leading to a ceasefire, then it will open up some space in the future for other issues, other priorities in the relationship. And there, once that happens, people in both Washington and Beijing are going to be looking for examples or opportunities where there could be functional coordination of efforts that could serve both sides' interests. And I think that keeping this conversation alive right now on counter-narcotics issues is important, because once we get to the other side, hopefully sooner than later, of the active fighting in Ukraine, this issue should be ready for further discussion.
Rupert, do you want to chime in on that?
Yes, I mean, obviously, when it comes to US-China cooperation, that could certainly be degraded by what happens in Ukraine, depending on China's activities, as Ryan said. I mean, there's another aspect of this. That's quite interesting, and there's a section in Vanda's report about India and India's role as a chemical supplier in the synthetic drug trade. And although India doesn't, the general consensus among experts, including Vanda, is that while India isn't on a par with China as a chemical supplier yet, it's certainly very significant and has the capacity to even catch up and replace China should China crack down on its own synthetic drug suppliers. But coming to Ukraine, the reason it's relevant here is, I mean, India has significant trade with Russia, not as much as it could be. Especially as an arms supplier, Russia is important to India, but there is in the pharmaceutical realm, India's very large pharmaceutical sector does export to Russia, and it should be added to Ukraine itself. So these exports could be dented by what's happening at the moment, by the war in Ukraine and by the sanctions on Russia. This is relevant because if the pharmaceutical sector in India fears its revenues are going to be eroded, it's going to be even more averse to regulation when it comes to curbing the diversion of chemicals, the use of chemicals in synthetic drug trade. So basically what we could see as a consequence of the Ukraine crisis is the Indian pharmaceutical sector is going to be averse to cracking down on these sorts of problems. And other things to add on this is India is very dependent on Russian energy supplies, and there are indirect respects in which the Ukraine crisis could affect its pharmaceutical sector. So petroleum products are an important part of the raw materials for its pharmaceutical sector. And then Indian energy imports from Russia are significant. So obviously the rise in commodity prices is going to harm India's economy and make it even more dependent on the pharma sector going forward. And the government's going to be even less willing to crack down on the pharmaceutical sector and rein it in. So what we could see in summary is this Ukraine business could shield India's pharmaceutical sector from scrutiny and from regulation, which is really the opposite of what's needed. I mean, it needs more regulation.
Claire, maybe I can just add a few reflections here to Rupert's and Brian's excellent comments here. And that, the Ukraine crisis, Putin's brutal invasion of a sovereign country and the brutality that he has unleashed there is really put a visible end to both the post-Cold War era and also the post-9/11 era. And we are thrust into a level of complexity, what I, for a better term, call the new tepid Cold War. One characteristic of which is that alignments are often highly limited by issue. And this is being quite reflected even in the US-India relationship for the reason that Rupert outlined. And I would also add, of course, the tremendous interconnectedness between the Indian defense sector and Russia. So the United States, I think, has been quite disappointed in much of India's public and arguably to some extent even private reactions to the Putin's brutal invasion. Despite the fact that India-US relationship have tightened under the Quad as a result of the India-China border disputes and the challenge that India has faced with respect to China at the border. And so there was, a hope that because of that and the willingness of India to engage in the Quad on a whole set of issues that it had not been willing to engage on before, such as cyber, such as deep sea naval issues and narcotics, with US India counter-narcotics cooperation having increased after really being very limited, that this would now have broader repercussions also with respect to China, and it hasn't. And so I can easily imagine the situation where India, like China, will be delinking counter-narcotics cooperation. And if India does become a more prominent supplier of Mexican cartels, that it's both its capacity and its willingness to crack down on its pharma diversion there, the lack of controls, will be very limited. And we will have both some of the same challenges that we have with a principal rival as we have with a country that we are hoping to be an important partner.
And I'm curious, obviously, the sanctions against Russia have had widespread implications on many economies. We're feeling it at gas pumps and across the globe. What role do sanctions like this have on the illicit economy? Could this change money laundering practices or the way drug trafficking organizations move their money around?
Maybe I can start with sort of two reflections. So the bad news, the very bad news, is that once again it privileges smuggling fewer tonnage, because transport is expensive. The less you need to smuggle, the better off you are. And that means that synthetic drugs, synthetic opioids, once again are enormously advantageous for drug traffickers, even more so than prior to the cost of shipping that we are seeing as a result of the energy prices. The other dimension is the one that Ryan raised. That is, will China allow Russia to evade sanctions by going through the Chinese financial system and trade-based laundering? Or will China prevent rubles and Russian investments to be escaping the Western sanctions through China? Anti-money laundering cooperation has been, or anti-money laundering efforts, I should say, have been at the top of China's law enforcement efforts. And there's been a considerable hope in the West that anti-money laundering operations could be one element of robust US-China cooperation as a result. In fact, so far, Chinese anti-money laundering efforts have once again been cast in a very narrow and self-serving way, predominantly focused on preventing capital flight from China, of repatriating money that was taken out of China in violation of capital controls, or money that was corrupt money that was stolen and removed out of China. That's been really what China has been most focused on in its regional and international cooperation. It has not been willing to cast anti-money laundering efforts more broadly to go against any money laundering, such as against cartels or money laundering related to the drug trade. Interestingly enough, we are also starting to see the rise of Chinese money launderers, many of whom are family-based networks, the very sort of mom and pop type of money launderers, that are being used by Mexican cartels, just as they are being used by Chinese diaspora and Chinese businesses to avoid the capital control. So the mixing of those two elements is happening, and yet the Chinese government's willingness to cooperate has remained small. And I would just point to one other dimension. What we are seeing in Mexico is something that we'll talk tomorrow in relations to the launch of a second of the report. And this is on on Mexico-China wildlife trafficking, where in Mexico, in order to evade US, Western, and Mexican anti-money laundering efforts in the formal financial banking sector, Mexican cartels are increasingly paying to Chinese precursor suppliers in wildlife commodities, in animals and plants, timber that were illegally caught and were illegally harvested in places like Mexico. And these connections of wildlife barter for precursor chemicals, both of which amount to only tens of millions of dollars, nonetheless poses enormous risks to biodiversity in places that we traditionally don't think as supply sources for China's voracious appetite for wildlife like Mexico.
Rupert, Ryan, anything that you'd want to add on that question before we transition into the questions submitted from the audience?
On the issue of sanctions and drug trafficking, well, in the broader sense, in the more abstract sense, yes, sanctions certainly do exacerbate the drug production, drug trafficking. I mean, if you look at a country like Myanmar, I mean, there's a general consensus that since the coup in February 2021 and the subsequent collapse of the economy and then the imposition of sanctions, that the drug trade would benefit from that. And I mean, generally, drug traffickers and organized crime in general thrives on poverty and unemployment and such things, and obviously those things that are exacerbated by sanctions. I mean, in Russia itself, we could see a growth in drugs, a growth in various forms of organized crime. So I'd say in general, there certainly is, they are intertwined, yes.
Claire, if I can just take one opportunity here to, one of the things that this conversation has really drawn out, I think, is how difficult it is going to be in the near term to make progress directly with China in dealing with many of these counter-narcotics issues. But I want to go back to where you started with your comments, because the obstacles cannot be an alibi for inaction. When 100,000 American families are burying, their mothers or their fathers or their brothers or their sisters or their children every year, we just can't accept that this is okay. And so if the pathways for direct progress are limited in the US-China context in this moment, then I think that we just need to be creative in finding other ways, working around China to try to build as much of a coalition as possible of countries that are willing to take those steps to list dual-use chemicals, organize as many countries as we can to build a coalitional effort and sort of make it a choice for China, whether they want to join a emerging regional or global consensus or stand apart from it. I think that they will feel more motivated to act if they feel like the price of remaining influential in regional and international discussions on narcotics controls is joining the consensus. I think it may also be worth thinking a little bit about whether it is possible to generate friction between criminal syndicates and the Chinese Communist Party. We know through Vanda's reporting that the Chinese prefer to try to co-opt rather than confront Chinese criminal syndicates when they can. But we also know that China's top leaders are perpetually concerned about the emergence of alternate power centers within China that are not responsive to or supportive of the goals and aspirations of the Chinese Communist Party. So are there ways to introduce, a bit of space to raise awareness publicly of gaps between what the criminal syndicates are doing and whether they are inconsistent with the interest and ambitions of the party leadership? And then just more broadly, I do think that there will come a point. I don't know when it will be. It could be next year. It could be in 5 years when the U.S.-China relationship makes another effort at exploring whether it's possible to establish functionality again. And we saw this, President Biden and President Xi, they have both acknowledged that the relationship between the United States and China at present is fundamentally competitive, but that competitors should be able to cooperate when it serves their interest to do so. We saw this during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, where both countries were able to cooperate on very discrete issues. And I hope that as conversations progress, that U.S. officials can continue to prioritize counter-narcotics cooperation at or near the top of the issues where we want to see progress made when progress becomes possible. Because the reality is that at the highest levels of government between the United States and China, dealing with China, which is a top-down Leninist system, it matters to prioritize these issues at the top and have them flow down. And when our leaders meet, each leader is usually only able to put a couple of issues on the table at a time, 2, 3, 4, and that's all that there's bandwidth for in the relationship. So I mentioned this just to put a marker down on the importance of continuing to prioritize this issue as we go forward.
Thanks, Ryan. We are going to turn now to some really great questions we've gotten from the audience. And Vonda, I think that we'll turn to you for this one. What are the most promising strategies to reduce Chinese shipments of fentanyl precursors to Mexico?
A difficult issue because of the small amount of precursor chemicals that need to be shipped. I mean, clearly, we need to be pointing out to Chinese government officials, and the government of Mexico needs to be pointing out to Chinese government officials that very blatant sales to Mexican criminal cartels are taking place. Some terrific work by another think tank in Washington, C4ADS, has highlighted how some Mexican sellers that are brokers or chemical companies, necessarily even the triads, are very blatantly advertising for Mexican cartels. There will be bundling together precursors for fentanyl, precursors for cocaine, cocaine fillers, precursors for methamphetamine, and they will be advertising in Spanish and even adding to their ads, we know how to clear Mexican customs. Clearly, they are going, they are going after Mexican cartels. Those kind of websites should simply not be operating, and the Mexican government should make every effort, not just to pull down those websites, but more importantly, to arrest, investigate, or at least warn, if it cannot charge because they're selling legal chemicals, individuals from doing so. And when the Chinese government wants to issue warnings to Chinese businesses and Chinese residents, they resonate because of the power of the Communist Party and because of the power of the Chinese government. Those messages are not dismissed like they might be dismissed in Mexico, where the power of the criminal groups often eclipses the power of local and other Mexican government officials. An effort to be then also monitoring more broadly supply out of China is important. And here it might be very worthwhile to continue thinking about how to encourage self-regulation in the pharmaceutical industry in general. This is something that's very much being thought about in the international counter-narcotics domain with respect to all kinds of synthetic drugs, not just synthetic opioids, also methamphetamine, encouraging producers and big traders and sellers of precursors and pre-precursors to adopt measures such as know your customers, not be willingly selling to criminal groups. Adopt due diligence measures, warn government officials, law enforcement officials, where they detect suspicious buyers. I think that's certainly something that needs to be pursued. It's not easy. A good analogy here is efforts that were adopted after 9/11 by the financial sector, by banks, to limit and detect terrorism financing and anti-money laundering, with banks being required as a result of US legislation and then international legislation that had been naturalized around the world to know their customers, to file suspicious activities report. And this has often led to very many reports being filed and little detection taking place, and still enormous amount of laundering taking place through the banking sector. So it's not been a roaring success by any means, and many of the measures came with some very problematic side effects. I think it's even more challenging in the pharmaceutical industry, where in a country like China, we are talking about thousands of firms, tens or hundreds of thousands of facilities, particularly when we look not just at the pharmaceutical sector, but also at more broadly the chemical sector. Similar in India, the scale is really tens of thousands of production facilities with limited government capacities to monitor. So I don't want to suggest that the self-regulation and private-public partnership in the chemical pharmaceutical sector is easy, but it's something that needs to be promoted and needs to be adopted, even if it doesn't end up being 100%, because we are simply not going to end up in a situation where tens or hundreds of W's chemicals will be scheduled. In my report, I outline another set of measures that can be adopted with respect to China, none of which are necessarily easy, and some of which need to be very carefully judged at what stage is the right time to adopt them. But let me leave it right now here.
We've gotten a number of questions on this topic, and Rupert, I think that maybe I'd like to ask you to take a stab at this one. Supposing an effective reduction in synthetic opioids out of China, how likely is that to be replaced by new producers in other geographies? A number of people have asked similar questions about just how the production of these precursors could just spread around the world if they're reined in one place.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very good question. I mean, we've discussed so far India. And it should be said off the bat that I mean, India's already been a chemical supplier for the synthetic drug trade. By the way, I mean India. I don't mean the Indian government. I mean the Indian private sector. But I mean, as long ago as 2016, there was a report of a Mexican cartel operative or someone allegedly linked to a Mexican cartel importing equipment and chemicals from India. And the general view is that after China scheduled the fentanyl analogs in 2019, that kind of catalyzed this change in trafficking flows. So the Chinese, as Vanda said, the Chinese chemical suppliers moved to shipping precursors to Mexico, and then the Mexican cartels would make the fentanyl trafficking into the US, rather than the Chinese directly shipping the fentanyl to the US. Anyway, the reason I'm making this digression is because my point is that the Indians were supplying precursor chemicals to Mexico long before 2019. And then again in 2018, some Indians were arrested for alleged involvement in fentanyl trafficking to Mexico. So in short, India has been already an alternative chemical supplier for the synthetic drug trade. And certainly the view amongst experts is that it could certainly replace China. It has all the necessary attributes. It has a very poorly regulated, very large pharmaceutical chemical industry. In some ways, it's, as Vanda's report says, it's even behind China on legislation and scheduling and issues like that. I mean, it's interesting that India hasn't scheduled fentanyl. And actually in 2014, it actually amended its drug law to allow fentanyl, to relax restrictions on fentanyl for medical purposes. So, you know, India is a very important part of this issue, and could certainly become a much more serious player in the future.
Vonda, did you want to chime in on that question also?
Essentially any kind of chemical pharmaceutical industry that's politically powerful and fully regulated could become a supplier. And so this is yet another reason to be encouraging as much globally as possible the adoption of best practices all the way from training through supply in chemical and pharmaceutical industry around the world. And we have countries with very good stringent suppliers, stringent controls, such as producers in Germany or in the United States. We essentially see no divergence of fentanyl that is used medically in the United States. It's a very important medical drug for reducing pain, used in surgeries, used in terminal cancer. We don't have diversion in the United States. We don't have diversion in places like Germany. We have illegal production that abroad that then brings the fentanyl to the United States. But there is also perhaps a way to think about encouraging self-monitoring and actions of behavior on the part of the drug dealers and drug producers. So in the earlier work that Brookings did on the opioid epidemic in the United States, some of our authors like Peter Reuter and Bryce Pardo explored the possibility of prioritizing law enforcement actions against dealers that give users a combination of fentanyl and some other drugs without disclosing to the users that they are in fact getting not just meth, but combo of meth and fentanyl, or a combo of cocaine and fentanyl. There is an interesting puzzle, for example, as to why we haven't seen the production of synthetic opioids in a place like the Netherlands, where there is widespread production of synthetic drugs such as ecstasy. And I would venture a speculation here that there well might be a sense that ecstasy is not prioritized as a law enforcement priority in the Netherlands, and that Dutch producers feel they will not attract strong law enforcement hand as long as they stay with ecstasy. But if they move to synthetic opioids because of the lethality, they might face a very different law enforcement action. And this is that kind of selective law enforcement deterrence measures that we should try to be encouraging in the United States, although at this point, not just the cat, but the herd of cats is out of the bag in the United States, but at least in other markets that are just now on the cusp of seeing the arrival of fentanyl, or might be seeing the arrival of fentanyl. Of course, when we are in a situation like in Mexico, where the criminal groups are simply not afraid of government officials, then those deterrence capacities tragically go away, and there's horrific repercussion for not just rule of law, but basic life in a place like that.
This is an interesting question. And again, Vonda, Rupert, I think that you both might have some really interesting insight into this. Has the increase in fentanyl production led to a decrease in the production of opium in Afghanistan?
Who's going first on that? The short answer is no. That's obvious just looking at the data for opium production in Afghanistan. I mean, the fentanyl production has taken off the last several years. During that time, opium has just kept increasing. So short term, no. Longer term is a much more interesting question, actually, because obviously, Afghan heroin in Europe. Most of the heroin in Europe now comes from Afghanistan. And there could be, theoretically, a supply-driven push to adulterate that heroin with fentanyl, spike it, as happened in America. And then the opiate users in Europe then gravitate to fentanyl. And that effectively just puts the Afghan heroin trade kind of out of business, or it would seriously undermine it. And that would have massive socio-political repercussions in Afghanistan, and obviously a huge public health crisis potentially in Europe. So an interesting question is why that hasn't happened yet, because fentanyl is so, from a trafficker's perspective, is so vastly superior to heroin. I mean, it's cheaper to make, it's easier to smuggle. I mean, for all the reasons Vander elucidated earlier. So, you know, it could well be a disaster that's waiting to happen. I mean, it should be said on the Afghan front, the Afghan drug trade has been diversifying into semi-synthetic drugs already. So you've seen much greater methamphetamine production in Afghanistan, but using a local plant. So it's not entirely a kind of lab-based, chemical-based synthetic drug production. It uses a plant, but still we are seeing a shift within the Afghan drug economy to methamphetamine, which could in future compensate for any blow it suffers from reduced heroin trade in Europe. But Vander, I'm sure, has more to say.
Just to add, you know, the fentanyl Afghan heroin story just shows how completely segregated the markets are. Despite the past 20 years of, or really despite the past 30 plus years of booming opium poppy production in Afghanistan, the US market has not been supplied by Afghan heroin. Afghan heroin constituted a tiny tiny segment of the US market. Where we have seen replacements is of Mexican heroin that has been totally eclipsed and pretty much decimated by the production of fentanyl. So the US opioid epidemic goes through these three broad phases. It starts with prescription opioids. And it's a very powerful demonstration of how heavily commercialized and abusive legal markets can create the most devastating drug epidemic in the US history. US pharmaceutical firms managed to create addiction opioid use disorder that an illegal market would never manage to do. Once the realization of how much damage prescription opioids were causing took place, and writing prescription opioid became much more controlled, but nonetheless, very vast number of people had opioid use disorder now, we saw a shift to the illegal market in heroin, and that stimulated a big takeoff of poppy cultivation and heroin production in Mexico. But in 2013, synthetic opioids from China start dramatically displacing heroin from Mexico, and we really see a very significant decline of poppy prices, and supply just shifts to fentanyl. And I would even sort of venture here that to a large extent, what is keeping the US cocaine market alive after years of decline is the fact now that fentanyl is being mixed into cocaine. So another sort of shift to watch is whether we will see further declines in the cocaine market because of synthetic opioids.
A number of questions have come in about the consequence of this on Chinese citizens. One reads, in general, nations that produce or are transits for drug risk, harboring drug use in their population. China does not fit that assumption. It's been involved in fentanyl production for a decade or more. Do you think draconian measures taken against people addicted to heroin in China is a shield against massive expansion of fentanyl users in China, thereby removing incentive to curtail production of precursors or final products?
Ryan, do you want to start? I'm glad to come in on China's internal.
Oh, no, I'll gladly listen to you. Thank you.
I don't think that the often very harsh policies that China adopts toward domestic drug use that tend to emphasize kind of a very punitive approach to drug users, and then tend to emphasize rather brutal methods of going cold turkey detox, are a cover for fentanyl. They long precede the rise of synthetic opioids. They have been the approach that the Chinese government has long adopted to dealing with drug use. And those are very unfortunate policies. We have very robust evidence that penalizing users and treating them harshly, not recognizing drug use as a public health, as a public illness, as a public health illness, as an illness, is deeply counterproductive. And it would also sort of come back to what I have mentioned before, that there are often gaps in markets. So we had many years of China being a very significant producer of methamphetamine before there became a recognition that methamphetamine use became a very significant, very serious issue in China. Despite the fact that we have paucity of data and that China often does not report in great level of detail the level of drug use and other drug-related statistics. But when this realization that meth consumption became a very serious issue in China took place, the Chinese government all of a sudden became far more willing to cooperate on meth responses regionally, internationally, and even moved to acting against the production or monitoring facilities that were producing precursors that were not scheduled. And the Chinese government would often say, well, we cannot do anything about those precursors because they are not scheduled. Now that they were supplying the Chinese market, all of a sudden, more creative law enforcement monitoring actions became possible. I would hope that we don't have to wait, or that we will not see China really making more of an effort to cooperate on synthetic opioids until synthetic opioids come to China. And I would posit that they will. Pharmaceutical companies, including some of the worst offenders in the US crisis, like Purdue Pharma and its international branch, Mundi Pharma, have been very aggressively advertising, lobbying in places like China, other parts of the world, essentially adopting many of the same methods that they adopted in the United States to con our country into causing the biggest drug use epidemic that we have ever seen. And we don't want that to take place in China, even as a reasonable balance needs to be struck between managing pain, a very difficult condition that patients certainly cannot be left suffering, but doing so in ways that don't cause massive addiction like we have experienced in the US. And that too can be a mechanism for cooperation and areas of discussions and sharing of knowledge and information between the United States and China.
Thanks, Vonda. We only have a few minutes left, and we've gotten a couple of questions on a similar topic. And I know that we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think it would be a nice way to end this conversation with, I mean, this all does seem pretty bewildering, and it's something that's going to take a very long time to rebuild this international infrastructure in some way to limit these drugs flooding into this country. You know, what can we do in the short term to try to cut back on this horrific devastation that so many Americans are experiencing? Is it expanded medically assisted treatment options? You know, what is the next best step before we can get to these longer term solutions? Vonda, could we start with you?
Sure. So we clearly need to act along the spectrum of possible interventions, including because no one single intervention is going to produce radical improvements that we would all like to see. So yes, absolutely. Expanded treatment, expanded access to health insurance, to cover treatment, methods such as safe prescription sites, supervised prescription sites to avoid overdose, to be able to have access to overdose-reducing medications, and be daring on the stringently monitored and evaluated basis of measures such as methadone maintenance or perhaps even heroin maintenance. being creative in what we can do domestically in terms of law enforcement, such as trying to make good criminals. What do I mean by the facetious phrase? Prioritizing law enforcement efforts against unscrupulous dealers that do not inform users what they are giving them. And consequently, users can have much higher rate of lethal overdose, or even overdose they survive, but might cause debilitating morbidity for the rest of their lives. And working internationally as much as we can. Ryan made very important comments about, even though cooperation with China might take a while to rebuild or even build, given the geostrategic relationship, working with coalitions of the willing, thinking about if the government of China is not willing to act, are there levers against Chinese pharmaceutical industry, against particular firms, against business, high-level Chinese businessmen. I outlined in the report some actions that we can take in this space to have them lobby the Chinese governments to adopt better methods. Let me leave it there, knowing where we are, so that Ryan and Rupert have a chance to come in as well.
Hey, Rupert, could you talk briefly about just what are the short-term solutions that are more actionable in the immediate future?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think one thing that can be improved is data surveillance for a start. And actually, it helps enormously if countries are more transparent with information. I mean, one example is, I don't want to pick on India because this is a problem that other countries, including China, have, is India doesn't report enough of its drug seizures and specifically precursor chemical seizures. So if you look at the public data sets on these issues, there really isn't an awful lot of information. And if there isn't the information, then it's very hard to know how much of a problem there is or what's going on or what you can do to counter it. So I think there has to be better information, and that theoretically is something that could happen quite quickly.
Claire, I will just offer my 2 cents to start out as a non-expert in this field. I would encourage everyone to read Vanda's recent report. It is the essential place to start for understanding what is happening and what can be done and what should be done to address this problem. And just at a broader level, I think that it's important for the United States to find its friends who are also being affected or could potentially in the future be affected by this epidemic, because the Chinese may not hear the voices and concerns of Americans as clearly today as they might otherwise, but they will pay attention to those in the region whose relations with them they care deeply about. I think that we also need to focus at home in the United States, improving treatment and care, prioritizing the law enforcement efforts to focus on fentanyl and fentanyl-related crimes. But lastly, we need to keep the conversation going with the Chinese, even amidst difficulties in the relationship. Both to continue to signal the prioritization we place upon this issue because of the impact it has on so many Americans every day, but also to share with the Chinese the experiences that we're having and to help them understand the potential risks they may face in the future through their own inaction, if, as Vanda has suggested, this issue continues to spread.
Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate the panelists sharing their thoughts, and thank you to our very engaged audience for joining us this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you all so much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.